Hi, James. So nice to see you again.
Oh, nice to see you, Chris. Hear you.
hmm
Yeah.
So this season has definitely been one for the books. What with the changes in health restrictions due to COVID, I have to admit myself, I've lost track. How many musicians are allowed on stage for symphony shows? What has the province declared?
Well, right now it's 25, and the challenge has been to be able to have programs like orchestral programs involving 25 players. So, if you can believe this, we've actually had during the season, we've had some optional programs where we could have either 40, or if the conditions change at the last minute, reduce that down to 25. Like our
Ah,
concert last weekend, the Schubert Fifth Symphony, we were able to do with 25 players. The Pops concert from before, back down the Danube, you and I chatted about, we could not do that because it involved 40. So there are real artistic challenges with all the restrictions and the changes that occur sometimes just days before.
right. And this is the reason why the concert needed to be swapped out. Originally, it was scheduled Beethoven Five and Beethoven Violin Concerto with James Ennis. It's the reason why it needed to be swapped out for the Mozart and the Brahms, right?
Well, also because James was not available,
Yeah.
he couldn't travel here, so we had an optional program prepared. But what that ends up doing is you have to actually rehearse two programs. You
Right.
have to have two programs ready, so you're rehearsing two of them almost concurrently.
Yeah, the musicians have to practice, the parts for both programs as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And if you watched our streaming, you'll see that the musicians are not sitting as closely together as they normally do.
yeah,
And that changes their whole perspective. So it's not an easy thing.
absolutely. But switching out concert of Beethoven's music to a concert that consists of Mozart and Brahms, it's a bit like switching out a Ferrari for, I don't know, a Bugatti or something. I mean, both the Mozart and the Brahms are amazing pieces, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, what's interesting about this program is that even though we are switching from larger forces into smaller ones, the challenges still exist, and the reward still exists. It's sort of like chamber music. You can go to a concert of Beethoven string quartets, and you end up leaving that concert with the same pleasure and the same enlightenment, often as you do in an orchestral one. So it's just a change of perspective, and this is a great program. I'm really happy about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the symphony is playing Mozart's Symphonia Concertante for violin and viola, as well as Brahms's Second Serenade. One of the things I found really fascinating about both these pieces is Mozart wrote his Grandioso Concertante when he was 23, and Brahms wrote his Second Serenade when he was 23 as well. And both pieces, the composers are both sort of experimenting with form in the case of Mozart with the Sinfonia Concertante and orchestration in the case of Brahms. Is this capricious youth that they're experimenting, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the thing with Mozart, he was further along in the compositional process at age 23 than Brahms was. Brahms was writing mostly for piano, and he was discovered, as it were, by Schumann. Schumann came to Brahms, and he was the one that called him a genius originally. And Schumann noticed symphonic elements in Brahms's piano writing. And Brahms, of course, was a little bit unsure of himself. He didn't have false modesty. He recognized that he possibly had the talent and the ambition to proceed in the great Austro-German symphonic lineage coming out of Beethoven, but it was a daunting possibility for him. So the serenade that he wrote at age 23 was he was very careful not to make sure that that was distinguished as a serenade and not as a symphony. And he did that by looking back to the serenades of Mozart by emphasizing the woodwind writing in it. There are no violins in the second serenade. That's
Right.
what's interesting. And there are five movements. So he did not want people to think of that as a symphony. That was an experiment. And that was his second serenade, not his first. His first was actually a nonette that he arranged later for chamber orchestra. So this was the first of his orchestral pieces that had elements that became familiar in his writing. Now, Mozart, if you go back, 1779, his last year in Salzburg, he was further along. And this is an interesting piece too, because what he does is he calls it Symphonia Concertante. It's actually a symphony with solo instruments. It's not a concerto in the traditional form that highlights the displays of the soloists, although this has plenty of those too. And for violin and viola, well, Mozart was a pianist, of course, but he was also an accomplished violinist, and he played the viola in chamber ensembles. And it's thought that he might have written this for his own participation in mind, and he actually tunes the viola up a half step from D to E flat to make it sound a little bit brighter as an equal partner to the violin. Very interesting work, and a great piece too.
But there's also some interesting orchestration in the Mozart as well. I mean, I was looking at the score on IMSLP. One of the things that I'm just thinking about the wind writing. He only makes use of 2 oboes and 2 horns, no clarinets, no bassoons. It's a very sort of thinned out texture with just strings and those 2 wind instruments, right?
Well, clarinets didn't come until a little bit later, until the 25th Symphony, the G minor. And the clarinet was a relatively new discovery to him, as you know, when Stadler came along. But this particular piece, the orchestrations are clever. The form is very clever too, because it resembles a symphony. You have a long orchestral introduction, and then out of nowhere, out of thin air, the violin and the viola, they enter. It just sort of, in a very, very surreptitious way, almost playing in octaves. And throughout the whole piece, it's a conversation between the violin and the viola. And they're equal partners throughout, which sometimes, if you took the sounds of the instrument, you would think that the violin, with its natural brightness, predominates and the viola is subservient. But here, Mozart's brought them together as one.
I love that piece. And one of the things that I find so great about it is there's this wonderful blend between the violin and the viola. They really are partners throughout the work. It's just fascinating. Why do you think Mozart wrote it for Skoda? I think it's called Scordatura tuning, not tuning. Why did he choose to do that, do you think?
Well, scordatura, it means you're mistuning. You're tuning the instrument to pitches that it normally doesn't find it living in. So the reason he did that, I think, is that he wanted the viola to sound more like the violin. He wanted the viola not to lose any prominence as an equal in the piece. So the piece is in E flat, but the viola part is in D with the strings tightened and tuned upwards. So what you hear throughout is that the violin in the sound and in the presence is more the equal of the viola, rather, in the sound and presence is more the equal of the violin than what you normally have. And even in the writing, as I said, it begins with octaves in an octave phrase. And then even in the cadenza in the second movement is more of a conversation than a display between the two. But that's not to say there aren't plenty of virtuoso elements in it. It's still a very difficult virtuosic piece for both.
Mm-hmm. And then we have got the Brahms Serenade. When you were talking about this before, there is so much emphasis with winds. I mean, like you were saying, there's no violins. I always think of the 2 serenades as sort of being trial runs before he committed to writing a full-fledged symphony. That's not to say that he didn't write orchestral music prior to his first symphony. I'm thinking here of his first piano concerto. But can you talk to that a little bit about? I always think of him as sort of dipping his toe in the pool of orchestral writing.
Yes, that's something that you sense. And what happened was he got a job in Detmold, and this is where he encountered an orchestra for the first time, and he got experience in writing it. So when you listen to the second serenade, you do have the sense that this is somebody that's just gaining experience writing for winds and writing for the full forces all at once instead of arranging it from something else. And I think what he was doing is he was looking back. Brahms was a great student of the past, of the previous generation, and Mozart was really just one generation removed for him. He wasn't looking back that far. But as you know, Mozart wrote great wind pieces. They're called a harmony, the great serenades for winds, divertimenti, the famous Grand Partita, which is an incredible piece, 50 minutes long. I wish we'd do it here sometime. And then you and I can play it. We play But so Brahms was really looking back. And by taking out the violins, as I said, then he's removing any hint of symphony in the formal sense. And by substituting the winds, he's reflecting back on what Mozart's efforts were in his own serenades.
Absolutely. And one of the things about Brahms is he was a huge fan of Mozart, like obviously, but I mean, I was reading somewhere that he once declared Mozart the greatest composer of all time. And didn't he also try to accumulate some of Mozart's autographed manuscripts as well?
Well, he did, but Brahms was an academic, actually, an academic in the best sense. He looked back all the way to the earliest German, Italian writing, back to Palestrina. He wrote articles about them. He studied them very, very carefully. And all of these sort of became infused in his writing, in the formal nature of it. And in the Serenade is where you get these first gestations of it. But the Serenade is a very entertaining piece too, because it has all these lilting melodies, gracious melodies, the cross rhythms that you find in Brahms, the beautiful blend of the winds. He really had accomplished a lot in creating the Serenade. Because Firm's story took 21 years to complete the first symphony, the Serenade had a lot to do with the development. It might have even taken longer had he not done this effort.
Right. Yeah, there's that whole thing about him being compared to Beethoven, which is such a monkey on Brahms's back,
It was,
right?
yeah.
Absolutely. James, the concert on Saturday night sounds just great. It's going to feature Gwen Hobig and Dan Schultz on viola. Have you heard a rehearsal? What does it sound like?
Well, I haven't heard a rehearsal yet, but I did want to mention one thing. That when you hear the Symphonia Concertante of Mozart, you really envision two friends performing this. I mean, so many times you've had very close colleagues, violin and viola, playing it. I remember in particular David and Igor Oistrakh, that's father and son, who performed it often together. And in this case, we have Gwen Hobig, who's been here since the 80s, many years. Dan Schultz has been our wonderful principal viola, almost as long. The two of them perform together almost constantly in the Winnipeg Chamber Music Society, many, many other things. So we're not only going to hear the piece depicting two close friends, but the performers who in real life are very close, artistically and personally.
It sounds like it's going to be just a great concert. James, thanks as always. It's just been a pleasure to chat with you. The concert on Saturday sounds just great, and sounds like it's going to be a great live stream concert. Thanks again. Oh, and I should also mention, if people want to download the live stream code, where can they go?
Oh, just WSO.ca. It's the easiest website to remember.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, James.
A pleasure, Chris.